Hey everyone, welcome to this week's release of the Hash Rate Happy Hour podcast. On today's show, my guest is Nick Phillips. Nick is the EVP of Hosting Operations and Public Affairs at Applied Digital. They are one of the largest, publicly traded, next-generation digital infrastructure companies in North America. Applied Digital is most known for their professional Bitcoin mining hosting services, and what makes Applied Digital so unique is that they seek to develop and operate ultra-low-cost digital infrastructure purpose-built for high-performance computing applications by bringing data centers directly to the point of power. On today's show, Nick and I will talk through what it takes to build data centers and Bitcoin mining infrastructure at scale, the benefits of load shedding for a utility company, and the positive impact that Bitcoin mining and large-scale data centers have on the local economies. This is an absolutely must-listen to conversation if you are considering scaling up your operation. Nick has a masterful understanding of digital infrastructure and traditional data center industries and how all of this ties into the benefits for a utility company. So with that, I hope that you enjoy today's show with Nick Phillips. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Like I said in the introduction, I'm here with Nick Phillips at Applied Digital. Nick, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, really looking forward to our conversation today. Very excited. Just in the recent couple of weeks here, we've had a nice little rally in the Bitcoin price, which is always fun to see, which Bitcoin miners always appreciate. Do you have any speculation on what's driving that hash rate to just go on a tear like it's been going?
Well, so not exactly, but what I would say, and having looked at mining and Bitcoin and things for years now, I've been in this space since mid 2017. So in terms of early to the large side of the industry, very early there. But there's a lot of ups and downs. It's very like cyclical, right? And I feel like the mainstream media or the mainstream, like the folks out there, kind of look at this cyclical nature of Bitcoin or any crypto generally and go, wow, it's really up and down. It's wild. Like it's very all over the place. And if you just look at it, it's got like these inter-year ups and downs. And it's not always like this. It's not exactly like this, but it feels like, at the beginning of a year, it kind of crashes, or like, right, maybe at the end of the year, it kind of crashes, and maybe there's something to do with tax season or like who knows what's going on there.
Yeah.
And then throughout the course of the year, it kind of rallies, and then you see like these spikes somewhere mid to late in the year, and then it crashes again. But the crash price point is still higher than it was at the beginning of the prior rally, and it's just like been this same kind of thing. So I remember back in 2017 in I think January, it was about $1,000. Bitcoin was at about $1,000, and of course, everybody all of a sudden knew what Bitcoin was by December of 2020 when it was $20,000. And then it crashed by March. I think March of 2018, it got to like 3,000, right? And everybody's like, "Oh, it's the end of Bitcoin. It's dead. It's over.
Yeah.
It's gone." But like, what did any of those people buy in January? Stocks or anything else? Real estate, stocks, commodities, gold, anything. What did they buy in January of 2017 that they had a 3x return by March of 2018? Like, you can't time the market perfectly and always sell exactly at the peak, right? So had you bought in January and held for 14 months, you had a 3x return. Yeah, you didn't have a 20x return. That sucks. But you had a 3x return,
Right.
and here we are again in 2022. It went to almost 70,000, and then it crashed, and it's the end of Bitcoin. Like $17,000. Bitcoin is dead. It's over. Well, like that's 17x from 5 years ago. What did you buy 5 years ago that you got a 17 times return on? It's crazy to me, and maybe I'm a maybe I'm very bullish on Bitcoin in that regard. But like, what did other people buy that got those types of returns? Like nothing.
Yeah.
Some people lost money, and shit coins. I'll just call them shit coins, right? And people who are running around trying to skirt SEC rules and raise money, and they have pump and dump schemes. Like they should just go to jail. Like they are ripping people off. Not all of them. Like there are some coins that you might call shit coins because there's not like a big infrastructure or whatever behind them. But like some bad actors out there are doing bad things and are ripping people off and should be in jail. Right.
Yeah.
There's other folks who are building really interesting technology and are building, what should be the future of all sorts of titling of assets, whether that's houses or cars or technology or commodities or whatever, that are very, very interesting. And some of that is unfortunately takes big swings up and down, along the lines of some of the bad actors and what they're doing. Look at FTX, and I won't say that he should be in jail, but we'll see. But there was a lot of crazy stuff going on in there that doesn't make any sense, yet negatively impacted all of the publicly traded miners and a lot of the coins and everything else out there that is really unfortunate. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
but just a general consumer, how can you possibly separate like what's the difference between FTX and Bitcoin or Coinbase and Bitcoin or a mining company or a hosting company like Applied Digital, or like how do you separate all these things just as a general consumer? It's very, very difficult.
Yeah.
Um, yep.
There's a lot to unpack in there for sure. The return profile of Bitcoin is absolutely what has me so bullish about it and interested in it. Maybe just to back up, actually, Nick, you had mentioned 2017 was right around when you started to kind of get into the Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining scene. I'd love to actually back up and maybe have you share your background and how that led you to Bitcoin mining, Applied Digital, and then maybe to round that out, give us a quick who is Applied Digital?
Yeah, sure. So I got involved. I was working with some folks in starting in 2015. Had a bunch of different companies. One of the guys over there had been mining since I think about 2013, and he wanted to build a big mining company. I previously owned a data center, small data center, traditional kind of data center. We did co-location, virtual hosting, stuff like that, and so I had some background um, in in building computer facilities that run a lot relatively large amounts of power. Didn't really, I suppose, at the time realize what that all meant in terms of where we were going. But they had some real estate folks that were looking for space, and hey, we're going to just get thousands of miners and we're just going to plug them in, right? Like some mining companies out there like that's, or some folks who are bullish on Bitcoin, they go from, hey, like Bitcoin's really cool, I want to do Bitcoin, but why should I buy it on exchange? I'll just go mine it. So then they go to Bitmain or wherever and they just buy a whole bunch of they buy a whole bunch of miners and they're like, I'll just plug them in. Like that's really hard. Like you can plug in 100 miners, maybe even 1,000 miners, just plug them in. 1,000 is very hard, but like 100, you can just plug them in. Relatively speaking, just plug them in and figure it out and be fine. So I set off on this path of cold calling around the country and trying to find a place to just plug in thousands of miners, and talking to power companies, and that company became the largest mining company in North America, um, and publicly traded. And unfortunately, they're in a bad spot right now, like many large miners are in terms of bankruptcy proceedings and whatnot. But that was my first dive into mining in 2017. Um, Took some time off, did some other stuff, learned how to fly airplanes and stuff. So I've got a pilot's license now. And in the meantime, and built some other businesses. I've got some art things going on with the wife. You see back there, and then applied digital, which was at the time applied blockchain. They had raised some money to go out and do mining. So they bought some GPUs and they were going to be a mining company. those miners were going to be hosted in China. This is back in 2021 now, and all of a sudden, China at the time, right around like March, I guess, probably March of 2021, China puts a moratorium on mining. No more miners in China. Um, China doesn't like mining for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, the lack of control over the currency. They don't get to manipulate Bitcoin, which that says a lot. And
Yep.
then two, they've got all sorts of power infrastructure problems that really materialized as coal prices and LNG and gas prices and things have just skyrocketed over the last 18 months or so. Um, but so all of a sudden, the Chinese folks or other Asian country folks that these guys were talking to were like, "Hey, can we host in North America?" And what I think was interesting in 2017, there was larger hosting environments in China, especially, and maybe a little bit of Eastern Europe going on. But North America, there hadn't really been picked as a good location. But it's just such a great regulatory environment. It's a safe location to do mining, and so all of a sudden, these guys, Wes and Jason, who are the founders of Applied Digital, thought, wait a second, there's actually an opportunity here. Maybe we should go out and figure out how to build a hosting environment, and we can host all these people who we were going to host with instead, and do something. So they found two of us who had built some facilities in North America. Very small bench of people who had built anything more than a half megawatt,
Yeah.
really.
Yep.
Um, I had put together a facility that was 35 megawatts and grew out to 85 megawatts. So we went from zero, which is huge for North America. And another guy on the team who built one in Canada, I think it was around 80 megawatts as well. So like very very little experienced folks found us, and then all of a sudden it was, well, we're going to build a facility, and we hit the ground running and got a 100 megawatt facility up and running. Basically within a year of that, we visited a site in North Dakota in July, worked our butts off to close on the land by September, broke ground the day we closed. Like literally, we had
Oh,
construction
wow.
trucks like waiting on the side of the road for the stuff to get signed. Broke ground on September 14th of 2021. Started turning miners on in January 30th of 2022. Um, we worked through one of the worst winters in North Dakota since the mid 90s. You had the same thing where you're at.
Yep.
We started getting miners turned on, and our contractors we had up there just were like crushing it. Like I had a really rough introduction to North Dakota winters that year, where I went up there at some point in February, and it's like negative 30 degree wind chill, 60-mile-an-hour winds. And I'm sliding backwards, I'm walking between buildings, like like ice skating on my tennis shoes, or not tennis shoes, but like boots, like sliding backwards, thinking, how are these people working, 10 hours a day, 6, maybe 7 days a week, and doing this? But they did it. Like they were doing it. So that's kind of the lead into Applied Digital. And now we've got that site up and running. That's our Jamestown site. We have two other sites under construction. They'll be online here in the near future. We're racking miners in one of them now. We're about to start racking miners in the other one, possibly this week. And once that's all online, we'll be near 500 megawatts of hosting online, which may make us the largest hosting company in North America. We're strictly hosting. We don't do we don't do any mining. Um, and I say may because there's a miner that has hundreds of megawatts online, but they're mining, and I don't know what their status is given bankruptcy and other stuff that's
Yeah.
going on with them and all the other folks out there mostly.
Yep.
And yeah, so it's hard enough to do hosting. Like the infrastructure, the buildings, the regulatory, the utilities, the community relations, the legal, like the list just goes on and on and on the hosting side. And to do that and mining to me is nuts. Like it's to do both is crazy.
There's a lot to juggle when you're doing both sides of the business like that. It's pretty incredible. And yeah, very familiar with the North Dakota site. Being
Yeah,
here in Minnesota, you guys actually did make news. I think more than once,
lots
just
of yeah.
celebrating, that size and scale of a facility dedicated to Bitcoin mining. So it's really cool to see that and watch that. Speaking of the hosting, that being hard enough as it is for a company to do, can you maybe touch on and talk through what the hosting environment looks like? And like you said, it's been kind of a rough year here for miners in general. Can you maybe touch on what does that hosting environment look like from your customer's perspective?
So customers are very sensitive to the price of Bitcoin and energy and everything else going on, and we're in a position where for the last many months, fuel prices have just skyrocketed. Right? It's kind of funny to feel, or to think about like the macroeconomics of what's going on globally really drastically impacts mining and associated costs. Right? So we've got um, the stuff going on with Russia and Ukraine, which of course is now has impacted gas prices, natural gas prices across Europe. There's some weird things that have been going on in Japan with liquid LNG, liquid natural gas, and they're willing to pay a lot more than folks had previously been willing to pay in North America. So it's like a lot of the fuel supplies have left North America, right?
Hmm.
Then there's fracking and problems with fracking and crackdowns from the administration, the White House, and whatnot, and all that. So all this has led to like this surge in energy prices in North America, and then at the same time, obviously the price of Bitcoin got crushed over the last several months. So you've got customers who want the price of Bitcoin to continue to be as far away from the price of power it costs. So that's been very interesting. And utilities are getting squeezed everywhere. Some utilities historically, if you look at the Northwest, like Oregon, Washington, I think more Washington than Oregon, some utilities made some deals there, going back to like 2015, 16, 17 kind of time frame, where they made deals with mining companies who would come buy a ton of power, but then they passed those prices, the increase. Sorry, let me say this again. They then increased the prices of all the communities in the area, which made for a very bad political situation for the few miners that were up there, and not even that big. I mean, maybe 10,
Yeah.
20 megawatts big. Um, which going and talking to utilities, like that's what they know about mining. Like they know there were problems, and consumers know, oh well, my power is going to go out because you're a big customer and the utility is going to give you power and not me in the middle of the winter. Well, guess what, we're the first ones to shut off, right? The regulators figured that out. So we turn off before anybody else, and we actually help the utilities to fix some imbalances, being a very large power user. And
Yeah.
so it's good for the communities for us to be there, because when there's too much power, we take it. And when there's not enough power, we have to give it up. From a legal standpoint, we're required to, or they just open our breakers on us. So it's it's interesting. Our customers have at this point more demand than we can fill. Like we can't build facilities fast enough. But I think our smallest customer is, I don't know exactly where they're, but they're tens of megawatts. They're very large in the mining space
Oh,
for our
okay.
large customers. Yeah, we don't take single customers. There's other folks out there. I think Compass maybe is one of them, and some others that they go get space and facilities. They're not in ours, but they go get space and facilities, and they'll sell space to somebody who wants to get one or 10 or 20 or 50 miners, or maybe even low thousands of miners.
Yeah.
Um, to me, if I were going to go mine, I would find something like that. Like, don't go do the hosting. Like, don't go build the facilities. It's tough. It's I like it personally. I like this side of the business, the infrastructure.
Yeah.
But it's not mining. Like, it's all about the infrastructure and keeping things operating.
And that's such a crucial point that I would maybe like to double click on. And before we hit record, we started to kind of dive into it. It's just some of the challenges around that, because I think, like myself, I've only got a handful of machines. Some, I run myself. Some I run through a small hosting provider. It's a headache to get just infrastructure in place. So
No, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Like if you're going to do mining, focus on the mining. Like look at what's your uptimes and what pools are you, pointing at, or what coins are you mining, and are you holding it, or are you selling it, or are you doing an arbitrage game? Like that's plenty complex too, you know?
right.
And that's enough to keep somebody occupied, or a team of somebody's occupied, to make sure that that's going well, right?
Yeah.
On the hosting side, we talked a little bit about power prices and fuel prices and whatnot. So the utilities are all squeezed, and they're trying to make sure they don't get themselves in a jam, right? So you have to come up with really complex ways of dealing with them on the hosting side to make them comfortable with who you are and what you're doing, and you can be responsive to the grid needs that they're required to maintain based on regulators and whatever bad actors have done to that particular jurisdiction in the past that has caused them to make rules, regulations, and laws and everything else. And then you also have supply chain issues. COVID did a number on every single manufacturing process in the world, right? So like, when do breakers show up, and what about this switch gear, and what about that wire, and wait, the price of copper, triples over some period of time because there's a hurricane. And I remember back in like 2018, Puerto Rico got wiped out, and I think it got wiped out again just the other day. And it's like all of a
Yep.
sudden, every single electrical contractor that does high voltage could go work in Puerto Rico for 300,000 a year instead of where they were working for 80,000 a year. So they all left, and copper prices went up, and so like there's just so many commodity issues and things that get very, very complex. We have a huge team that deals with all the project management and procurement and tracking of things, and where is it and when is it going to get there, and it's like a lot of work. um,
Are you guys still seeing my first episode was with a municipal power company here in Minnesota, and he was telling me a year and a half is a reasonable lead time right now on a transformer that would service, like 1,000+ kVA transformer. You're at a year and a half. Are you guys still seeing stuff like that?
we buy so many transformers that it's not that for
Okay.
us. um, it is that every I talked to dozens of I don't know how many utilities I've talked to in the last 12 months, probably 200. All of them say that they're 18 to 36 months for transformers. That's what everybody tells me. um, we don't I don't see that on our side. We get transformers faster, but if you show up and say I'm going to order 500 transformers, that's a different conversation than, hey, I'm going to open I want to order one transformer that's not off the shelf. Because when we buy 500, they can make a production line of that, or they can open new shifts for us. So our steel
Yep.
buildings, we try really hard to near source everything that we can. So our steel buildings for Jamestown, we had manufactured about 8 miles away from our facility, and it was really tough to get that done. But ultimately, we found a company that was willing to open a second shift and run the buildings during a new shift that didn't exist. But we were buying so much of it that they could go out and hire people to go do that. And then they liked having the extra shift, so they kept the extra shift because there is a ton of demand. But you can't just go, hey, I'm buying, a 10,000 square foot building. Please open a second shift for me, because they can't hire people and give them enough work to do that for a period of time. So
Yeah.
you get to do some extra cool stuff when you buy a lot of things.
Yeah, especially when you're buying at that scale. That's pretty cool to hear, because another thing that I have heard is, well, Bitcoin mining is going to come into town and they're only going to provide one job for a big site. So the rhetoric is, it doesn't really produce a big economic impact to the local economy, when in reality it just looks a little bit different than an immediate job at the facility.
Yeah,
So
so
it's cool to
so we
hear that.
talk to a lot of utilities and economic development folks in various states, and you'll talk to some states. I live in Tennessee, right? So Tennessee, for example, the utility around here, TVA, and all the various co-ops that they work with, that they like to think about, well, we want to attract people who are going to hire 200, 300, 2,000, 5,000 people, and that's what they care about, right? Like that's their numbers. And so for us coming in and saying, well, we're going to build a 100 megawatt facility and it's going to have 30 jobs, like they just don't care. Like there's no care in the world. But what I can tell you is, as a very specific example, our site manager at one of our new facilities before working for us was a night shift manager at Walmart. He came in as an entry level position as an operator, entry level, like the very bottom of the food chain. He started there. He became eventually a shift supervisor. Went from shift supervisor to assistant site manager to site manager inside of a year. And
Wow.
so for that guy who's from that community, who lives there, right? This is life changing. Like going from a night shift manager at Walmart, which is a pretty decent job in a rural part of the country, to running a tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars of equipment, for including our customers' equipment facility, is life changing to that guy. And it's not just that guy. It's the operators that are working electrical jobs or facilities or maintenance, or they're farmers or they're whatever, and they get to learn about this technology and they become part of this next generation data center, in and get to stay in their rural communities, which has benefit to them, right? Like if I'm a rural guy growing up in a town of 500, right? One of our communities is 527 people,
Yep.
and I'm going to find a job. I don't want to be a farmer, right? Now I'm going to find a job in a big city, different quality of life, different way of living, lots of neighbors right on top of me. And all of a sudden I'm living there and mom and dad aren't there. I don't have the cousins for the kids. I don't have the grandparents to help babysit. I don't have that support system. It's it's very disruptive and in my opinion negative. Like I grew up in a large city, but like I live in a relatively small city now, and I see this. And being able to have an opportunity to be in this high tech environment, even if what I'm doing isn't necessarily high tech, like I get exposure to these really cool things. That's a huge value. And those 20, 30 people, it's huge value, life changing value for those folks and their families and their kids, and like what experiences they get to have is gigantic. In some of these communities, like the 500 person community that I mentioned, or the 1,000 person community, 30 jobs is absolutely massive. That is
I
huge.
Yeah, I was going to say, as a percentage of that town, that is impactful just on its own, even though it's only 30 people.
Yep, and
You
forget
just yeah.
about and not to forget about the secondhand things that are going on like that. Those are our direct hires. Now look at the secondhand. What's going on. We hire security, right? They don't work for us. They're not our employees, but that's 3, 4, 5, 10 employees. In some of these locations. Look at the restaurants. During construction, we might have 50 to 150 construction workers for 6 to 12 months, that are taking hotels and restaurants and grocery stores and everything else. I can tell you, I I can't stay at a hotel right next to our facilities because they're full. I end up driving 30 minutes because I don't go to our facilities every day, and these construction workers, they rent the rooms for 6 months. And so I end up driving 40 minutes. So like all of the hotels inside of 20 and 30 minutes are taken,
Yeah.
um, for months, right? So what's the impact on those folks, and what improvements can they do? And like there's all sorts of things going on, that our utility partners, when we find them and they get it, they see it and they go, "This is great," right? Or the towns, they say, "This is great." But some utilities, some states look at it and go, "Eh, it's 30 jobs in a state, of 6 million or 10 million or whatever." Like they just don't care.
Yeah.
But it's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. That's really cool perspective. So I really appreciate that. I would love to go maybe into, you know, North Dakota. So I live pretty close to it. I know it pretty well. And what, so it's kind of a two-part question is like, you guys sprung up a very large facility. I do know the power company, and I think you guys became their number 2 or 3 customer in the span of like the snap of a finger. So How did that conversation go when you're talking about the magnitude, 100 megawatt in a town of 500-ish people? That's impressive. So how did that conversation go on maybe the first approach, and then as that continued? But then also, what is drawing you guys to North Dakota of all places? All you hear is Texas, 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 Texas.
Yeah.
I'd love to
So
hear both of those.
yeah. So there's a few questions to unpack there. So every utility I've ever talked to, you show up, and this goes back to 2017, right? They go, you don't actually need that much power. You've got something wrong with you. Like
Yeah,
your numbers are wrong. Like you have no idea what you're doing. That's like out the gate. That's number one. That's the beginning of the conversation. Um, we do know what we're doing. We do understand how much power we actually want, and we establish that. And it typically takes a few phone calls on it, shockingly, to get to like the right person who actually goes, okay, these guys aren't full of it. And so that's a whole process. But then sometimes we find a utility that they're all about what we're doing, but they're a small utility. They have 200 megawatts on their system, and we're talking about putting 200 megawatts or 300 megawatts on their system, or maybe they have 70. I talked to one that they have 70 megawatts in their entire utility. Like that's the total load that they serve is 70 megawatts, and we're showing up saying the minimum site size we'll build is 100. Right? That's the minimum.
yeah,
We'd like to build 300 megawatts at a time. 100 is the minimum, and so they just can't handle it. Like just from a business risk standpoint, that'd be like you're a small mom and pop business and Walmart shows up and says, "Hey, we'd like you to produce 8 million of this unit per year and we're going to buy all of them." And then your customers you've had for 20 years and 50 years and whatever, you're like, "Sorry, I have to do everything Walmart tells me to do now."
yeah,
Like that's the perspective that their boards and their communities, and not that we're going to bully them around, but like that's the perspective. And what's the risk if one day Bitcoin goes away, or and we do other things in Bitcoin, right? We do HPC, and that's brand new for us, but we have other things going on. And so, what happens if that changes? What happens if we choose to shut down the facility for something that's outside of their control, and they've got a bunch of money invested in there, and revenue, and jobs, and employees, and everything? So it's a very scary proposition, right? So it takes a lot of getting used to who are you and what's going on. We have the benefit of being publicly traded.
sure.
Um, we're listed on Nasdaq, so our financials are public. They can believe when we tell them what it looks like that it is what it is. Because if it's not, there's jail time involved for auditors and
Yep.
finance folks and everything else, right? So like, it's it's easy to look at the financials and understand who we are and what that looks like. Um, but then they look at the industry and go, well, Bitcoin is going down. This, especially last year, it's like, wow, Bitcoin was 70, now it's 17. Like, what does that look like? And unfortunately, for a lot of the mining companies and the folks who are having bankruptcy and insolvency issues now, there was basically free money. You could get as much capital as you wanted to go out and buy as much equipment as you could because Bitcoin was 70 grand almost. And people took on a lot of loans that, you know, hindsight's 2020 look
Yep.
irresponsible. I wasn't in the room making those decisions. Um, but took out a ton of debt that all of a sudden they couldn't service um, because you can't get big enough. There's not a big enough arbitrage, right? There's margins when Bitcoin is $16,000-$17,000 and power is whatever it is wherever you're working. There's margins, but the margins get squeezed, and now all of a sudden, a lot of miners found themselves in a business where they're having to sell every Bitcoin that they ever mined, right? A lot of miners sold all of their their coins
Yep.
just to pay debt or to just get by. And then all of a sudden, that just flooded the market even worse, and it's like this spiral out of control, right? Like it's like a run on the bank, sort of, but not exactly. Um, and so it just made it worse. So the utilities look at that and go, well, how the heck are you going to pay me? You know, And good news for us is we don't take Bitcoin or anything else. We collect our fees in U.S. dollars. Our revenue is U.S. dollar driven. We have to put up huge deposits. If any of your viewers here are miners who are looking to do this on their own, they're going to put up gigantic deposits with the utilities just to give them comfort that they're not going to run off on their bill. So we have access to credit facilities, being publicly traded and having the financials that we have that some folks won't. So for a lot of miners, that means writing a check, right? Like you might have to write a check for $100,000, $200,000 just to the utility, just to say, please turn on the power, right? They're
Yep.
going to hold on to that money just in case you disappear. So there's a lot of getting comfortable, right, with the utilities, and they're used to all utilities pretty much are used to most of their customers being very, very, very small percentage of their business. And then we show up and we're going to be a percent or 10% or 30% or
Yep.
80% of their business. It takes a lot of getting comfortable with who we are and what we do. Luckily for us, our power team, our head of power, he worked for a regulator, he worked for a generator. He has a lot of insight into how the utilities work and operate. So when we have these conversations, they're not educating us so much as we're convincing them and showing them that we understand their business and how they operate and that we're compatible. Where a lot of miners will show up and say, hey, my miner takes 240 volts, and I bought 10 megawatts of miners, and I'd like to turn it on tomorrow. Where can I plug them in? And the reality is that a utility, somebody was asleep at their desk and should have been or probably was fired if they had 10 megawatts of 240 volts just sitting there waiting for a customer to maybe show up one day, right? It's not field of dreams. It's not like if you build it, they'll come. Like they don't operate like that. They build stuff on long time horizons. Utility goes, oh, 100 megawatt customer. Okay, you're going to start talking to me today. You're going to turn on in 7 years. And the miners are like, okay, I'm going to start talking to you today, and I want to plug them in like right now.
3 months,
So
right? We can do 3 months, right? Yeah.
yeah, 3 months.
Yeah.
And so it's very incompatible. And I find myself still today getting frustrated with utilities, and we have great utility partners. And I get frustrated with them because I'm like, what do you mean we can't turn this on in 6 months or in 3 months or 2 months? Or like, why is there a 3 week delay? Because to me, 3 weeks is material, and to them, it's a blip, right? Because they're used to
Yep.
7 year timeframes or 10-year time horizons on their projects. So there's this huge incompatibility in speed because what they're doing is hard. It's not simple either. Like I don't want to be in the utility, but that's another hard business. Of course, you had some miners who wanted to get the utility business, and that's been tough too.
Yep.
So
So what then is the draw out in North Dakota?
so North Dakota has a lot of good features. It's cold, obviously. The cold is great, but actually too much cold is not great.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to deal with it's too cold. It's -30, and the miners won't mine, right?
Humidity
Or
problems. Yep.
yeah,
Yeah.
North Dakota from a business standpoint, very very friendly. We've by and large had just an overwhelming positive reception from the regulators and folks, community people. Like everybody has been great. I've found that the North Dakotans are very hard workers. Have to be if you literally won't live if you don't farm
Yep.
during the right times of year and have things right. So that's been a huge draw for us. The communities have been good to get into. Once they figure out we're not full of it, they've been very welcoming and work with us, and that's been excellent. The state, the governor announced, I don't know, last year before, a plan to get to carbon neutral by 2030 or 35 or something like that, as many states have
Yep.
made those types of announcements. But they realize where some states don't realize that there's a transition period. You can't take thousands of workers who are working in coal who don't have a licensure as electricians to work in regular electrical facilities because they're regulated by MSHA or some other regulator that has a different set of regulations. You can't say, hey guys, we're shutting down all the coal plants right now. We're shutting down every natural gas plant. We turned them off. They're gone. And tomorrow your job is going to be working in a wind farm or a nuclear plant or something. So, so from my perspective, North Dakota is taking a very pragmatic approach of how do we transition from this energy that's maybe not so desirable, coal, to something that's much more desirable, you know, or how do we make coal more desirable, which is a big part of the conversation. Like, how can coal be net carbon negative, right? Like it's sequestering more CO2 that's in the air than it's outputting, and and it has a very interesting geology. There's some very interesting projects going on in North Dakota, or maybe going on in North Dakota, due to the geology of the state. There's these saline deposits, like these saltwater deposits underground that they can pump CO2 into, and it's a really good storage medium
Oh,
for
wow.
sequestering CO2, right? Like, so the state could be a net negative um, from a CO2 standpoint, as compared to other states that are like, oh yeah, we'll just shut down our nuclear plants, and uh, we're going to mandate that everybody has an electric car by 2035. Wyoming did the opposite. No electric cars by 2035. I thought was pretty funny. But like, no internal combustion engines, no fuel using power sources by 2035. California declared that, I don't know, a decade ago or something. It's just, it's impossible. Like,
Yeah.
it just doesn't exist. It's detached from reality. Where I feel North Dakota makes statements about this kind of stuff, and they're not detached from reality. The reality they understand. Like, they're producing coal power for these states that don't produce coal power, that say they don't want it, but they have to have it because literally little old ladies will die in their sleep in the middle of the winter at night if they don't have the coal power, because there's not an alternative.
Yeah.
So North Dakota brings a lot of really interesting environmental factors, which today are powers from the grid, but we would love to be 100%, you know 100% ESG, everything else over time, whether that means wind or solar or geothermal or whatever it is. But the reality isn't that's not today. That's 10 and 20 years from now. And looking at very, very large power consumers like us who are willing to take on new technologies is the way to make that transition, right? Like, somebody shows up, I've had a conversation with a company that says, hey, we'd love to build a 200 megawatt plant that's, geothermal in North Dakota, which doesn't exist right now. And we're going to do it using these different technologies that are also going to do these other things. Like, how do they find a customer that will say, yeah, I'll build a 200 megawatt load right next to you? They can't.
And that would be kind of a like a monetary bolt on for that company, right? To help them monetize
That's how they
that as
monetize it and
okay.
prove the technology works. So you've got people running around saying, shut it all down, right? But they don't have a real practical plan on getting there. But if you get out of the way of industry and instead you incentivize industry to say, hey, hold on a second, let's convince folks, like, let's get out of the way and convince folks to go do something really, really creative that could change, the pollution or whatever it is associated with generating energy in a meaningful way, and get out of the way to let a customer who would love to buy power from them prove out that this technology works. And then all of a sudden, you could be talking about a plant that might be 20 megawatts that one day could be 2 gigawatts, right? But it needs to get a chance to get there. Like,
Yeah.
a bunch of 20 megawatt facilities in different technologies need to be built and fail, right? In order to find the one or two that are going to work and change the way that we do things. And private industry is the best setup to do that. And there can be some government backstop to make that happen. And there is, in various states. There's all sorts of programs for hydrogen hubs and things like that that could be very, very interesting. So it can kind of de-risk the innovators, like the entrepreneurs, the innovators who want to go out and build those things. But those innovators and entrepreneurs, they'll still need customers, and it's 10-ish years, could be 7, but 10-ish years to build transmission lines to move that power from one place to another. And if you put those facilities where the metropolitans are, then the folks that live in the cities are pissed off because there's a plant that's this weird new technology. What if it catches on fire and blows us up? Like, who knows? So the
Yep.
rural areas are the places where those things can be built, but there's no load there. So we're a perfect fit for that, and so are other. There's other manufacturing and other things that are perfect fits for that. But North Dakota seems to embrace and understand that in a very wonderful way.
Yeah, I mean, and that's just I really appreciate you walking through the why North Dakota. That I mean, what really incredible technology and just some really good foresight for how to make that energy transition happen, because it is a transition. It you don't just turn off the power and then request for the power. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah,
So Nick, I kind of an ending question for the show is, I want to be respectful of time, is of all the conversations you're having, your team's having, what would you like, not advice, but, talking to a power company that may not understand Bitcoin and the play for their grid,
yeah.
what would you say is something that, maybe they could pay more attention to, or help them understand, how Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining fits into their grid system?
Yeah, so we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to get in front of utilities to have those conversations. We've joined a few associations, and um, our EVP of power, he went and spoke at one in Florida last year, and I went to a renewable one for wind and spoke at that. And, you know, there's huge value for utilities in interruptible loads, gigantic value in interruptible loads for utilities. Utilities build peaker plants to deal with if they have an outage. They have to have more capacity, than they're having to serve, so that if one of the plants goes down, that little old lady isn't freezing to death, in the
Hmm.
middle of the night, kind of a thing. So they're having to invest tons of capital in building more infrastructure than they need, right? And interruptible loads like us, data centers, whether it's for blockchain, which we serve, or HPC, like AI, machine learning, neural networks, things like that, which we're also um, getting into that as a business. Um, these are great loads as long as they're interruptible, to be able to balance out and deal with a lot of issues that go on the grid. It takes a special utility to understand that. Some utilities get it. I think regulators are starting to see that that's a need. The Uri storm in Texas a couple years ago is wreaking
Yep.
havoc on the Texas legislature right now. ERCOT is going through. Texas has a really interesting thing where every 10 years that all the different entities have to justify that they exist. And ERCOT happens to be going through that right now, just a bit after Uri. So like, there's some really interesting things going on there. But I know in like Minnesota, regulators are trying to push interruptible loads onto the utilities, and the utilities are sitting there going, how do like where what do you mean interruptible? Like, who needs 100 megawatts or 200 megawatts, or where are we going to find 500 people who want 1 megawatt that would then turn off because a steel mill will ruin their machinery and be shut down for a month if you shut off in the middle of a run, right?
Yep.
And same with all the manufacturing programs out there. So it's it's really great if you can find somebody at the utility to talk to, but if the utility isn't already thinking that way, it's very difficult to convince leadership in utilities that this has the value that it does. So when we find utilities that see the value and understand it, it's a huge win-win for both of us. It's better for the consumers that are near us. It's better for us. It's better for the utility. It gives them better returns on their investments. All over the place. It helps everybody. Um, and so if they don't understand it, and most utilities don't understand it, they should understand it. We're happy to be a resource and talk. I mean, selfishly, we want to build more facilities, right? So happy
Yeah.
to chat with folks, but ultimately, we can't fill all the capacity in the world. We can't build all the sites, um, but happy to have those conversations. And we are working through where are the right forums, and how do we find more people to talk to about this. So if any of your utility folks that you chat with have like places they go or would like to talk to, happy to get involved there. But there is just an incredible amount of value in interruptible loads, whatever it is, blockchain, data center. Traditional data centers have a hard time interrupting. Um,
Yep.
I think we may have some solutions there as a company to make that work. But any interruptible load is huge. I mean, even here again in Tennessee, where I live, TVA figured out, hey, it's better for us to pump water up to the top of this mountain when we have too much power, and then release it down the mountain and spin a generator when we have too little power. And they figured that out 60, 70 years ago, right? And there's a 50% cost to that, right? So if they pump a megawatt of, if they spend a megawatt to get the water up there, they get a half megawatt back, but better to get a half megawatt back than zero. Um, and so utilities understand, that kind of a thing, but they don't look at it the same way with us because we're not storage per se, but
Yeah.
we are able to release energy as needed. So that's a whole very long conversation too.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I appreciate that a lot. And Nick, I've really enjoyed our conversation. As we're kind of winding down the conversation, why don't you give our listeners, our audience, how do we get in touch with you, Applied Digital? Maybe go ahead and plug your guys' services, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find us on our website. It's applieddigital.com. There's two D's in there. We're traded on NASDAQ. APLD is our ticker symbol. You can find us through that. Me personally, you can find me through LinkedIn. If you go look up Applied Digital on LinkedIn, I'm on there. I'm accessible. I'm a busy guy, but love having these types of conversations. Ben, you and I connected earlier about a different topic, and here we are. So definitely happy to connect with folks. Those are really the best ways.
Awesome. Really appreciate it, Nick. You take care.
You too. Thanks a lot, Ben.
All right.